Bear Grylls, Sybil, welcome to the show.
I feel bad because it's taken about 15 minutes to get to this stage, mainly because of me. Not your team have been amazing. I've had all like the family, dogs, and everyone coming to join, but I think we've basically relented, haven't we?
Yeah, I think it's great. I like the dog. I like the fire. You were teaching me about birchwood and what I'll ever need to do if I'm ever in a survival situation, how to start a fire.
Well, that's good. I kind of figured like we're outside. We've got Sybil to come and join us. We better have a fire lit, and then it's all good.
It's all very cozy, isn't it? It's all very cozy.
Well, I don't know. I was saying to you before, I find if I have to do chat shows where it's like really in a studio, I find it all quite scary.
Yeah.
I find it quite intimidating. I get really nervous about them, but I do have to do them. If you like promoting a show in the States, part of my work, so I kind of go and do it. But this sort of thing is, first of all, love all you do. I think you're a brilliant man with a great brain and also a great heart. And I look at you as like a truth seeker, which is wonderful, you know. So for me, this is kind of fun. So to be outside, it's nice to have a fire, have the dogs. It's kind of, this feels a happier place, less scary place.
It's gorgeous. And you're not promoting a TV show at the moment. Yeah. You're promoting and discussing the greatest story ever told. You've retold the story of Jesus's life through the sort of first-person perspective of various people. I want to jump into it, but why this book? Why now? For some people, it might be a bit of a surprise. You know, you're the adventure guy, and here's this book about Jesus.
It's a little bit of a surprise for me as well, to be honest. But you know, I don't know. Faith has been part of my life for a long time, just kind of quietly. Helped me so much over the years, you know, through so much. And I know I just had a really strong, weird feeling last year of like, clear the decks, clear the decks and write this book. And I just realized, like, first of all, so few people know the actual story of Christ. So few people have like read the Bible, you know, if you ask regular people. And yet the story, if it's true, is so life-changing and so beautiful. And I just thought nobody's ever done it, like told the actual story as a thriller. Short, accessible, easy to read, punchy, theologically accurate, but done as like a sort of, you know, as like a beautiful love story thriller. And I really just had that feeling of like, clear the decks and write the book. And I wrote it actually in a month in the jungle. I was with my son. We were filming another show either side of it. He kept thinking I was on drugs or something. He goes like, you're just writing all day and all night. But it's like, wrote it fast. But then it's been the hardest, but also the best thing I feel I've ever done. And I've said this a few times now, but I would give up every other kind of work accolade in my life to have done this. It's the thing actually I'm most proud of, because it's changing lives and it's touching hearts all across the world every day now. And it's only been out a few months. And I think out of everything I've done, this is the thing I've had the strongest, warmest response from. And like, even just this morning, like message after message after message, when I sort of look at my phone, or a team send me things of like people from all cultures, all faiths, or non-faiths, just saying, mainly I had no idea. I had no idea of how incredible this story is. So really proud of it, you know. It's and I feel it's just beginning in a way.
Well, for those who don't know, what you've essentially done is taken the story of Jesus, which in the New Testament, we have our sort of 4 Gospels. We've got these 4 accounts of Jesus' life, and they're told in the third person and quite sort of sparsely. You know, like I think, for example, of in the birth narratives where, or just after the birth narratives, where Jesus is sort of, he goes missing, right? Like his family, his mother and father suddenly notice that he's not there, and they search for him for 3 days, and they go and find him at the temple. And in the Gospels, it's sort of very much like, well, they noticed he was missing, they looked for 3 days, they found him in the temple, and then he was teaching. Whereas what you've done is you've taken stories like this, and you've told them from a first-person perspective. So you start by assuming the personality of Mary, the mother of God. And you retell the story because, of course, if your child goes missing for 3 days, that's not something which is it's easy to sort of fully depict in sort of 3 short sentences. So you sort of try to expand upon that. But the obvious question is, like, how do you go about doing this? How do you go about taking a story where, like you say, you've got to be incredibly careful to be accurate, because you're telling and like, as you see it, the most important story that's ever been told, but you're kind of having to embellish it in a way. You're having to bring in emotions that aren't made explicit in the text. You're having to get inside of the mind of these characters and speak to these perspectives which are not in the scripture. So how do you approach that while being careful to keep it accurate?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's like, first of all, you're right. You know, the New Testament, if you just look at it, the story, the way it's written is so sparse.
Yeah.
You know, and every story of Jesus is like that example you said of him getting lost. You know, even through the crucifixion is like Jesus was taken to the place of the skull and crucified.
Yeah, right.
Done.
Yeah.
You know, that is it. And I suppose what I've done is expand that a little bit, say actually what that means. So, you know, so rather than just saying he was taken to the place of the skull and crucified, I will say, you know, the Roman soldier grabbed the iron bolt, knelt on Yeshua's, you know, arm, drove it through, and, you know, the words mumbled from his mouth of, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. You know, so just try and put context kind of to it, but at the same time be absolutely theologically kind of accurate. And, you know, the first thing we did was just take a timeline of like, okay, here we go. Because you got 4 accounts. And as you know, the Gospels differ. It's part of the sort of beauty of the authenticity of it is that like they differ, you know. So we first of all had to take the timeline and then pull out the kind of the actual, one thing I didn't change a single word of is the words that Jesus spoke. So that was like, when I had that kind of feeling of clear the decks and write this book, the next feeling I had was like, but do not add a single comma to actually the words that Jesus speaks. So I use different translations, different versions for different, you know, encounters, different scenes, but I don't change a single word that he says. What we are doing is setting the scene for each of those kind of times, you know, he is speaking. So that was part of the challenge, but, you know, I feel we've done it okay. We did a lot of work on it afterwards. I mean, I worked with a lot of theologians for this. Right. So, you know, I actually feel this is no longer my book, actually. It's a genuine sort of feeling of like, it's outgrown me. Yeah. It has a life of its own now, but I'm really proud of the help I got. Andrew Ollerton was incredible. Dr. Andrew Ollerton, who's this super well-renowned theologian. I worked a lot with the Come and See Foundation in the States, who are behind things like The Chosen, the TV series. Right. And they had a whole team of theologians that really we had some pretty intense Zoom calls of, you know, like you can't conjecture that. You got to rethink that. And it's like, so we really worked hard for that part. And that's why really they're the kind of being in many ways the actual heroes of all of this.
Well, The Chosen will be a comparison that surely comes up a lot here because, I mean, The Chosen, this TV show that serializes the life of Jesus, they have no choice but to put words in the mouth of Jesus.
Well, they have to go further because they're doing so much more, you know. So they do create dialogue for Chosen, and actually I think they, you know, by their own admission, it's one of the things they get, you know, criticism for. I think everything's arguable either way. I think they see it, and I see it with The Chosen as well. They just do a brilliant job of pointing people towards the light and towards the nature and the character of Jesus. Yeah. But with this book, I really wanted to keep it really tight.
Yes.
You know, so the only thing we're going to contextualize is this situation of Jesus, whether it's Jesus meeting this lady, this Samaritan lady at the well, the first time he reveals to anyone on earth his actual divinity. You know, we're going to set the scene for it and then let it play out.
Yeah. And one of the choices that you make there, because of course you tell the story through the first person perspective, you start with Mary, and then it's Thomas next, and then Simon, then John.
Yeah, you
got
a good brain. I said this at the start. Well done.
That's just memory.
True.
But that second part, it's Thomas, right? It's through the eyes of Thomas that you see Jesus talking to the Samaritan lady at the well. And I suppose you have to make some interpretive choices here in that, like, in the gospel account, Jesus is at the well and he's speaking to the Samaritan lady, and then the disciples come and join him, but you've sort of taken Thomas and you've placed him there like a
Well, I've
like a
placed him as
viewer.
an observer.
Yeah.
So it doesn't mess with the scene. It doesn't mess up the dynamic because it's a very intimate moment,
Right.
really.
Yeah.
So things like that, you had to just require some thought and some planning and how to do it. But I felt that was kind of a nice way of doing it because it's not messing with the scene or altering the scene, but it just gives a reason for him observing it. But I like Thomas in this. I think the book starts off very innocent with Mary.
Yeah.
As this young teenager, like, he's just been told you're going to give birth to the Almighty, the Son of the Almighty. I know we get so used to it, like with kids' nativity plays and stuff, but it's a pretty shocking revelation. And also it's pretty shocking if God's going to come to earth, to come out of wedlock, born out of wedlock, to somebody is, of such no social standing and such poverty. And so it starts very innocent. And as you say, it's kind of like, even losing Jesus as that 12-year-old, it's like the panic of all of that. But then I want to go in harder with Thomas of like, it's going to take more than a miracle with some wine to change this heart.
Yeah.
Because I kind of feel like taking these 5 different perspectives in the book, it becomes all of our stories. Because all of us at times are the skeptic. All of us are the doubter. All of us are the betrayer. All of us are the arrogant. All of us are the nervous and scared. So I kind of wanted it to have all of these perspectives because that is life. And it was also the reality of their experiences. Though, the people that surrounded Jesus were all of those things. The one thing they weren't is very together or intellectual or brilliant. They were just regular young people. I mean, it's the other thing people forget. The average age of the disciples, 15 to 25. It's really shocking that for me. It was like, hold on, I'm so used to big paintings of Peter with a big beard sat on a rock, But they were kind of like, wow, what is going on? And I kind of relate to that.
That's one of the reasons that The Chosen is so celebrated. I think what it does well is that so many pieces of Jesus media are about Jesus, whereas this is really about the disciples. It's the chosen. It's the chosen followers of Jesus. And you are sort of going along with them, encountering this character of Jesus, which is what this approach does as well. It puts you in that first-person perspective. But you've said that Thomas, you want to sort of represent different sides of everyone's personalities, and Thomas is the doubter. I heard you say on a different interview that sort of faith and doubt are two sides of the same coin. And of course, any Christian believer will go through periods of strength in faith and weakness in faith. And I suppose right now, especially with the book and the feedback, you're probably feeling pretty good about Christianity and the position in the world. But I wonder if you can talk us through.
Don't assume
whether that's true. And
well, I don't think it is true.
Where you're at.
I have many doubts. I really do. I have many moments of real struggle. I don't think it would be right to say like I'm like super confident in my faith. I think I'm the shaky part of this. I really am. And I struggle with many things. And I've just learned that is okay. So when I say faith and doubt, two sides of the same coin, it's not like sort of 90-10, faith and a little bit of doubt, because, I think it's a myth that you find a faith and suddenly like it all comes together. I think for me, finding a faith was like that pilot light, boom, that happened. That light went on. And like, I was a teenager, it was like, I knew it, but nothing dramatic happened. But there was a light there, and that's never gone out. But like a gas flame, sometimes it goes up, and you have moments where like, I know, it's like I've just experienced, this is incredible. And the moments where it's like total madness. And I think actually this last year I've had really challenging moments of like, can it really be true? And, it's where community and sort of good people around you make such a difference. And I feel my brain is really limited. I really do. I feel like I wish I had a better brain. I wish I had a better memory, better understanding of so much of the theology. It's actually why this book has helped me as well. And I listen to the audio of that book all the time, still, even though I've written it, because it's like the simple stuff is the important stuff. And I think sometimes with theology, we get so buried in the semantics and the weeds and the religion that even in our own hearts, we lose sight of what it was about. I mean, Jesus said it so simply. He said, I've just come to seek and save the lost. And it's like, I'm proud to have been amongst the lost.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to complicate. I don't want to sort of over-religify sort of the job. I'm not asking to be made a theology don.
Yeah.
I'm just really happy to start the day on my knees and to receive help.
Mm.
And I try never to complicate it beyond that. So I wouldn't want people to get the impression or the feeling like, I'm riding high on faith. Because to be honest, that is a daily thing. The daily struggles are real. But through it all, I kind of hold on to a few promises, even when I'm not really feeling it. And I kind of still somewhere in the pit of my heart and soul, I know I'm loved, and I know there is a presence out there, and it's good, and it's for us, for all of us. But beyond that, I really probably struggle.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't mind that. I've learned that that's just part of life.
And I suppose part of the
Does
decision...
that make sense?
Of course. And I think putting the story in the voice of Thomas, who is traditionally thought of as the skeptic because of that episode at the end of Jesus' life. Although even in Thomas's life, I think there's a period where Jesus wants to go and visit someone who's died, and the disciples say, what's the point? This person's dead, and it's Thomas who stands up and says, no, we should go with him. So I think Thomas is sometimes a bit maligned as being fully characterized as doubting, but that story definitely captures that. But I'm really interested in hearing you say that how, even listening to the book that you wrote, because of the fact that it takes you back to what's important, it can be quite sort of comforting remembering that that's what it's all about. But presumably in the process of putting that together, because you've got to make these choices and you've got to speak to theologians and you've got to look at this chronology and, how does it go together? Like John's gospel has Jesus flipping the tables at the temple near the beginning, and the synoptic gospels have it near the end, and you've got to sort of work it up. And I wonder if the result is a reminder of the beautiful simplicity of the core story, the process of writing it, was that a process of finding these things and going, gosh, I don't know about this, and experiencing doubt in that process? Or was the process a more sort of invigorating process for your faith?
I think, I think sort of putting context to the story brought it alive more and more as I did it.
Right.
Of taking it out of, as you say, the sparse simplicity of just how it's written in the New Testament. To be honest, that was always my experience. I'd always try and, as part of my daily life, read a little bit from the good book, try and do it every day. But it could be hard, and I think once you actually get into the stories, and also we become so familiar with the stories, that's the other danger. And that's why that's why Thomas, for example, I don't call him Thomas. He's Taum. Yeah, they're all the local Aramaic names, because I think otherwise you go, Thomas, this guy is going to be full of doubt. When actually, as you say, he was probably incredible. Had a few moments of doubt that becomes his trademark signature for the rest of human, mankind. So I wanted people to arrive like I was arriving at this, totally fresh, of no expectation. And what's been so interesting, I've had so many notes from top theologians around the world. And when I see it coming in, I'm always like, oh God, what's it going to say? It's going to be picking holes in this. And because like anything, nothing's going to be perfect, But actually, time and time again, it's like going, I read this and I thought, that's interesting. And I find myself referring back to the accounts and realize I hadn't actually noticed that. It's actually right. It's like, and I don't know, there were loads of little moments like that. And that was my journey of discovery as well. Of, even little things, like we always think the first people that saw Jesus were the wise men.
Right.
Because of course the wise men would come before the rough shepherds in dirty clothes and bad language and stinking of horse manure. Of course the king was to come. But as the first people to see the baby Christ were the outcasts, the people who weren't even at Passover time allowed into the town because they were considered unclean. So they were kept outside the city limits always. But the star leads these rough speaking, rough, shepherds in to see the baby. And it's only really, they think, like 2 or 3 years later that these mystics, again, not, they're called wise kings, but actually they were realistically, I think, sort of Eastern mystics,
right,
who had been following this, the alignment of the stars with this conviction that the Savior is to be born in the city of David. Yeah. And they come and they provide what eventually is financial support for the years that they were about to live as refugees when they were.
That was really interesting, because you talk about sort of them being gifted this gold, this sort of golden ornament, and this frankincense, and these gifts aren't really reflected on, but yeah, it made sense to think, well, if this precedes a flight to Egypt, this could be what they used to get through.
Well, I think part of it, I mean, again, it's conjecture, isn't it? Who knows, But it makes sense. So like maybe the gold was just gave enough to last those years of living as nomads and refugees in the Egyptian desert, But then again, that would have been only the gold, I read a thing on this the other day. I can't remember what the frankincense was for, but certainly the myrrh, I think, was a burial one, So that was, is that right? I think it's right. Frankincense was something else.
Yeah.
But again, there's so many elements like this that we skip over, that it's like, for me, it's like too brilliant,
right,
to just have this story to have fallen in these places, and that's a part for me is reassuring. And back to your times when you're saying of doubt, one of the ways I deal with my times of doubt is to look back of like actually into, and that's why this book has helped me so much in my own journey of faith. But I almost feel it's that phrase, the theology of embarrassment. Have you heard of this?
I don't think so.
It's that if you were crafting a true story, there's some embarrassing elements to the story.
Right. Yeah.
Or I think maybe they call it criteria of embarrassment.
Yeah, absolutely.
That just you wouldn't do.
That you wouldn't make up.
The child of wedlock, the sort of, you wouldn't write of yourself like betraying Jesus 3 times or appearing first to women and, in the resurrection. And it's a whole list of these sort of things and it's those elements that always kind of, I find reassuring.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I come from a very simple brain, I really do.
But I think it's brilliantly put together, and I some things jumped out at me. I've been trying to study the New Testament for years now, and so it was really interesting. I can imagine why you're getting emails from people saying this is really weird. Like people might read, for example, that you say that there are 5 wise men, 5 magi. Most people think that there were 3.
Well, where's that come from?
But the Gospels don't say that.
Exactly. It's little things like that. But
which also, I think, allow people... I really think that when you go and watch that nativity scene at the school or whatever, and you see... and
the green lobster in the manger.
Yeah. Like, there are the 3 wise men. Yeah. But if you see 5 of them come in, it just sort of stops you for a second. And even though you know that those are the magi, you think, oh gosh, there are 5 of them. Why are there 5? Wait, who are they? And it makes you sort of see it with fresh eyes, as it were. So I was wondering,
it's fresh eyes that is how I encounter this, and it's fresh eyes for people that I want. And that's why I think people are responding to this, because if you arrive with the preconception of like, this is a book about this, and this is what I know, it's like, I want people to start from ground zero. This is where I started. And it's like, I think the other factor is we've had 2,000 years of the story being ruined. And I really feel that. I feel there's 2,000 years of an awful lot of religion has ruined it. Dressed it up in sort of a lot of sort of, corrupt churches and corrupt sects and corrupt sort of, religions. And I don't know, it's just like, we've done a really good job as humankind of spoiling a really beautiful story if it's true. And I kind of feel like in my own life as well, it's my own journey of faith was that as well. I found I had a really beautiful natural faith as a kid, whereas like, I know that it's just, there's a connection, it was no more than that.
Yeah, right.
And then I went to school and suddenly like everyone was speaking in Latin and wore white robes. It was all very full, I had a mini version of what humans are experienced 2,000 years of thinking this is what God is telling me not to do this, speak in Latin, behave yourself and shut up. Yeah. So for me, it's been a lifetime of unraveling that to find actually that's the bathwater, dirty, grubby, was probably going to make you sick.
Mm-hmm.
But the baby in this thing, if you can take him out of the bottle, is amazing. And I want people to experience that baby, the real story of how it really was to have walked that land with this man. I want people to find that afresh.
There's something, I mean, finding it afresh implies that, I can pick up this book and I've never heard this story before and I'm discovering this. But also, if you are familiar with the New Testament, you'll pick this up and hopefully it'll be new. Like, if somebody came to you and said, I've heard about this Jesus guy, but I've never really understood the story before, would you say to them, like, this book that I've written will take you through that story? Or would you say to them, tell you what, go and read the 4 Gospels, then come back and read this as a kind of commentary or retelling? Like, would this be a starting point for people?
Because I think it is a starting point. But the irony is, it's also like at whatever level you're at, it works. Yeah. And I think ultimately you're never going to improve on the Bible. The Bible is always going to be number one, because you can't improve on, but I think it's stepping stones. It's cold. It's hard for people to go to cold to boiling in one step sometimes. Sure. And I've had this experience with one of my best friends who's a brilliant brain, like you, an Oxford guy, strong sort of atheist guy. And I remember saying to him years ago, I said, do you know that you should just read the 4 Gospels? And he goes, no, you're right. I've just got to do that because I actually haven't studied. I'm going to do it. And then kind of didn't, or then dipped in and then got a bit bored. Because as you say, it's sparse.
Yeah.
To me, when you have faith, it's like the scales come off a little bit and you see the sparsity as the beauty.
Yes.
And the honey is there. But it's hard to just say, read it. So I kind of wanted to take people on a bit of a journey with that. And that journey takes many forms and that will play a part.
Those decisions that you made, like, some of them are seemingly a little bit arbitrary, like the 5 magi, not 4, not 6. Like, did you just sort of pluck that out of thin air? Did you just have to go with something?
I want to trip people up on what they think of as real, when actually it's just convention.
Right. Okay.
I wanted people to go, hold on, and most people would just skip over that. But I quite like it when I get theologians going, I kind of was interested in that. Mary, I always thought she rode on a donkey to Bethlehem, but actually, there's nothing about that. The donkey was Jesus rode on a donkey into Jerusalem for that final week as a symbol of servitude. I kind of like tripping people up on things people think is real to help them find out actually what is maybe real. And along the way, there's, because again, I think that's been my journey of like, you get so used to hearing people talk at you from a church. And that goes in here, but it doesn't go in here. So sometimes it's like you need to disconnect to reconnect.
Yeah. And that chronology that you were talking about before, when you sat down to put this together, you have to make some probably relatively tough choices because they're quite thematically relevant. Like if Jesus flips the tables near the end of his life, that's maybe part of the reason why he's arrested and crucified. Because at the beginning of his life, then it's not. Did you just sort of sit down in the jungle and work it out for yourself? Did you consult theologians?
That bit we did
how did you
really
put that together?
Carefully with theologians. And he does flip the table at the end.
At the end as well.
But he also does at the beginning.
Yeah, because that's doing it twice is the solution, right?
Which was the solution. And sometimes that sort of thing works because that's accurate. One gospel says it's done the beginning and on a separate occasion. And then there was another, that epic sort of final week is important to get, that chronology absolutely right. But exactly when he crossed from Galilee to feed the 5,000 and to free the demon-possessed man in here and that journey, we kind of, you just got to kind of eventually commit to one way, haven't you? And that's why there were these epic Zoom calls with a lot of theologians where we'd eventually go, let's do it like that. But it's interesting. Some of the discussions were like things like, but hold on, Jesus didn't have brothers and sisters. The Catholics will really fervently believe he didn't have brothers and sisters. And it's like, and I'd written it in this early bit with brothers and sisters, but of course, then the Aramaic translation of brothers and sisters actually implies a wider family of cousins. And it was like, let's not even trip people up on it. I don't want to put that line in that about Jesus' brothers and sisters and then lose Catholics who go, well, because I don't agree with that, I'm going to discard the rest of the book.
Yeah.
Those are called stumbling blocks for people. So just remove it. Take that bit out. Don't be a stumbling block. Let's get people to the real meat rather than getting sort of hung up because we're arguing about the herbs in this meal,
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about the sort of brothers.
So just take it. We just took that line out, and we did that a lot on things.
I was going to ask, are there other bits that you just sort of removed that
yes,
you would have otherwise
lots of
written
things
about?
that in the first draft, it's like, actually, that's going to be tricky for people of different faiths and stuff, but it doesn't add anything to the story.
Right.
So let's just keep it flowing.
Can you think of an example? Not to make
Well,
you have a position on it, but the kind of debate that you thought wasn't worth having in the book.
I think that was a key one.
Right, the brothers.
Yeah.
Yeah, because of course it's the question of the perpetual virginity of Mary, right? If Jesus has brothers, then Mary's had other children, and if he doesn't, then maybe she didn't.
Exactly.
And I can see why that's, at least in a project like this, worth just sort of left untouched, perhaps.
Yeah, because don't be a stumbling block. All I want for this is to be a bridge for people, a gate for people. It's what it's proving. That's why I get these people of so many cultures and faiths writing about this. It's an accessible way of finding out this love story.
Mm.
And I don't want to be a stumbling block. It's why we've changed the names. It's why we've gone back to the old names and the old places. So you arrive at it fresh.
Yeah. You spoke on another podcast about this analogy that you draw. Only you mentioned how people have sort of messed up the story and gotten it wrong over the past few thousand years. And I think it's pretty easy to point to examples of where people have gone astray. And you've compared this in the past to Elvis Presley?
Well, first of all, we're all part of that story of messing it up. So I'm not sat here going, religion's messed it up, you've messed it up, you've messed it up. I've messed it up, is the truth. I've messed it up because none of us tell the story of Christ very well. So when my Elvis thing was like, most people love Elvis, but we think the Elvis impersonator is a little bit weird, which is sort of probably a fair description, and I feel that a little bit about faith. If you actually get to the meat of, of the story of Christ, what his nature, which was radical and free and laughter and, like the Pharisees, the main accusation for those 3 years of his ministry against him is that he was a glutton and a drunkard. At which point Jesus would have roared with laughter and said, on one hand, you're saying to my cousin John, you're like this, and there's me, you're saying, it's not how we imagine Jesus.
Right, exactly. You sort of imagine.
So I feel like the church has, and we are part of messing that up because we've formalized and we've put it in religion. We've made it all very kind of like, it's our human nature. We like to put things in a box, but love doesn't live in a box. So we're always going to kind of mess it up. I am part of that, even to the extent, I'll give you an example. Like the other day, my eldest son, his girlfriend, who's wonderful, she goes, just tell me about the faith stuff. She was reading she saw the book. And I kind of stumbled through some really, and after about 3 minutes, I thought, I could see Jesse look at me going, well, it's like, you're making absolutely no sense. And it's like, I just thought, I've explained this so badly. And it's like trying to describe a really sort of, trying to describe swimming to somebody who's never seen water. You jump in this thing and it's all around, it keeps you up, can feel pretty scary, feels like wet and like crazy, but then like,
Yeah.
And she was so sweet, looked at me like, you're really making no sense. And I thought, thank God love shines and spreads without, thank goodness it's not all dependent on us, because I don't do a very good job of that. So I include myself in the messing up of the story over 2,000 years. We've all been part of that.
It's amazing to hear you say that because of the way the book turns out. So I guess, you can think about it a bit more and consult people if you're having issues. But that makes me think, I understand if someone just comes to you and says, tell me about this faith thing, tell me about this Christianity thing. It's like, whoa, where do I even begin? You must have had that feeling right in the book. Like, did you write this in order? Did you just sort of sit down?
It was a terrifying thing. But I kind of like really just felt compelled to try and start. And I knew where I was going to start, which was picking up the phone to Andrew, who's just become over the years a brilliant, brilliant friend, and is probably the best theological mind that I know, and is really sort of calm and measured and just brilliant. and just said, how would we do this? Where would you take that chronology, for example?
Mm-hmm.
What I knew I wanted to do was to get the Spirit, to get to strip away, to show why was he called a glutton and a drunkard? Why did everyday people just want to be with him? Why would people fight to get through the crowd just to touch his cloak? Why did the religious elite fear him so much? What was it about this guy that is so the opposite of what I was brought up thinking Jesus was about? Why? That's what I wanted to get to. And then it was just assembling a team to help kind of get it accurate, because ultimately I really cared about that. So much so that even when things were right, we pulled the whole first print run of there were just few things I'd seen after. I thought, hold on, that's not quite right.
Oh, really?
And it's I just felt this has got to be right.
Yeah.
And it's why now I do stand actually with, tentative confidence behind it. Not total confidence, because it's sort of human and it's going to have some few flaws, but actually with a good degree of confidence. That's why actually now when I see these emails come through from the professors, my confidence has grown with it.
Yeah.
Is at 99.9% of the time, it's I was expecting it to have holes, but actually good job. And that's down to a good team on it.
So this was on its print run and it was ready to go, and you sort of
there were 50,000
and
copies ready to go.
And you pulled it.
I paid to pull it, yeah.
And was it something in particular, or was it just a vibe thing?
It was 3 or 4 things, and it was just it's just I knew we'd it's just got to be right. I can't explain, it's like a feeling, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I ended up pulling it, and ended up at the end of it, the editor said, we worked then for a month, redid it. He said, we're good to go. He said, do you know how many changes you've done since you told me it was good as we were ever going to get 3 months ago? He said, you've done 1,200 changes to it. So it's I almost know every page, every kind of paragraph on this book now.
I bet.
But not out of anything, but apart from it's brought me closer and closer to the nature of Jesus that I first kind of fell in love with, and is been such a beautiful part of my life. And I need it. I really find it for me, it's bread and butter and honey every day, that this story.
You don't start with Mary. I mean, you do, but there's this very brief prologue where you sort of flash forward to the road to Emmaus, and you've got these 2 disciples walking along the road. Jesus,
the first thing I wrote for this book was that page.
I was wondering if you wrote that, because a lot of authors will finish a book and then they'll go back and they'll figure out how to open it. But why was
it was the first thing I wrote? Because I don't know. I just really.
Why was that the place to start?
Because it was a revelation of me of I wonder what point the penny dropped with them all. Those people who spent all this time with Jesus. When do you think the penny dropped? Because you think this divinity was shown all the time, and yet I kind of find it reassuring that as disciples, they're regular people, and you probably wake up the next day and you kind of already questioning yourself.
Yeah,
goes, hold on, but that guy who was frothing and foaming at the mouth, and then was or that arm that was here is hold on, maybe,
Yeah.
And I don't know, I just love that scene of even at the end when he told them, so I mean, he tells them once, gently, he tells them twice, about what's going to happen to you. I will be, and eventually he's sitting there again, I will be tortured, I will be crucified, and I will rise again on the 3rd day. It's no metaphors, it's he's spoken stories and metaphors all the time, but it's this is clear, now listen to me, boom, boom, boom. And even then, they're not anticipating it. They just really think it's the end. And I just love that bit of Jesus being playful. I mean, I remember before writing this book, reading a 300-page book on just the playful nature of Jesus. Again, something kind of I'd never thought about, but so playful all the time. And I like that idea of him toying with them as he reveals on that road, saying, tell me what's been happening. And they go, you idiot, what do you mean tell you what? You must be the only person in the world that doesn't know what's happened the last few days.
And that part's actually in the gospel, isn't it? Where they say, you must be the only guy who's not
totally
heard.
And I like that. And he's let me, and he starts, and then they go, it's that wonderful line of, did not our hearts burn within us? Because that's the start. For me, that was always a place to start the story. Now I want you to go, why?
Yeah.
Why does this make your heart burn within you. And it's the ultimate question of life, really.
Yeah. I think it's an important decision that you make to not change the words of Jesus. But inevitably, you have to do some things with Jesus. So, for example, when you're talking about his upbringing with John the Baptist, his cousin, and at one point, for example, you describe, John as being a bit sort of boisterous and telling jokes, and Jesus as being the more sort of quiet one. So you do have to make some decisions. I suppose you didn't have to, but you chose to make some decisions as sort of giving Jesus, personality traits, especially in his younger life. That again, was that like theologically informed? Was that a council of theologians on Zoom, or was that you just thinking, this is what I imagine?
I think that's okay. I felt, it's a line. It's just beginning to introduce this nature of Jesus, because actually you don't get to meet the guy until you're a third of the way through, really.
Right.
The meat of it happens there.
Yeah.
So we're just pointing towards his nature and his character in a way. But when it comes to actually the first words and the last words, they've got to be absolutely right. I didn't want to change a single one of those.
Yeah. And then did you otherwise write the book in order? In, did you just sit down and start with Mary and then just...
Yeah.
And did you decide before you started writing it, these are the viewpoints? Or did you sort of write up to the wedding at Cana and then go, let's go for, how about Thomas now? And then you go, let's go for Simon.
I did that with Andrew and with Craig and with another of the theologians. We kind of thought, we should be really contrasting interesting perspectives to get it from. That covers all of humanity, basically. So that's why you want the innocent to the skeptic, to the arrogant, to the impulsive, to the broken, to the clinical, because that's all of us. Everyone's going to be one of those.
Were there perspectives that didn't, were there like names where you were like, maybe we could do it from this person's perspective that didn't make it? Or was it sort of those five?
I feel we covered it really well. It feels beautiful ending with Mary Magdalene as a sort of broken teenager find it and then encountering Jesus and just like, she's so all in and so human with it as well, and very tender sort of way to end. I feel sort of wraps up the quite sort of male middle bit of it, and it's I don't know. Jesus always affirming women. That was it felt right. Top and tailing the book with it at that.
Yeah, I had a podcast with a scholar called Helen Bond who wrote a book called Women Remembered, which is this sort of rediscovery of the women. Because I mean, two of the characters that you speak from the perspective of are women. And there's this extraordinary thing in the Gospels where you can read all the way through the narrative, and then right at the end, when Jesus is being crucified, it says, oh, and by the way, there were these women at the cross. Oh, and by the way, they had been following Jesus and funding his ministry, like from their own pocket, like this whole time when you didn't get a mention until now. And so I agree that it's a worthwhile pursuit.
And also, like you've got Mary Magdalene and then Mary, the mother of Jesus, at the foot of the cross.
Yes.
Where's everyone else?
Yeah.
The answer is
they fled
in terror, which is kind of reflective of all of us, really.
Yeah.
And I don't know. There's so many bits. First of all, I'm really touched that you know it so well, and you've read it so much. I think you just got a great seeking heart. It's amazing. But there's certain parts of the book that really afterwards really have stayed with me.
Yes.
And I thought it was interesting, it might be interesting for you. But one was the first time Jesus starts to do anything supernatural, which I don't know if you've ever thought about this. But it's like, where are these 17 years, between, temple, getting lost, day 12, and starting this ministry? And I don't know, I just get a feeling, and again, I don't know if this would be right, but it kind of feels like natural and right. It's almost like he knew as soon as he started to do something supernatural, the clock ticks.
Yeah. Because that's what happens. Mary comes to him.
And Mary is the one, and they're at this wedding, they're having fun, and they're like, Jesus is letting his hair down, he's having fun with his friends, and it's his mother. Like, I know I really related to this, as like, I don't know, maybe with your mother, or like, some mother's tugging his seat, go, I need to talk to you. It's like, I'm having fun.
Not now.
It's like, but there's a problem. It's like, it's not my, and he says, it's not my problem.
Yeah.
Which is like really interesting.
Yeah, that is.
Because everything for the rest of his life is his problem.
Yeah.
He's in everybody's element of all their life.
Yeah.
In a beautiful way. Healing, touching, affirming, correcting, guiding, helping, loving. But then he goes, this isn't my, it's like, he knows, it almost feels like he knows that once I begin, the clock ticking. But yet on the other side, it's only a mother that knows, like, when, time to fly, spread the wings, time to fly. And eventually she keeps tugging. And then what I like is that Jesus doesn't even respond then to her. You know what she does? She just tells the servant, she knows she's got him.
Yeah.
She just says, do
what
whatever he says.
Yeah.
And it's like, boom. The journey begins.
Yeah.
And for me, it's like, this is how I try and live my life. Like I that's become a real thing for me in my faith. When I have my struggles and when I have my doubts, I go back to that of like, just do whatever he says. And it helps me.
Yeah, I'd not thought about that. The prospect of somebody coming, and of course, it's Jesus's mum, and this is at the beginning, and it seems like a relatively trivial thing. We've run out of wine.
Yeah.
But the idea of someone coming to Jesus for help, and him going like, "It's none of my business."
Yeah.
And yet you're right. As soon as he makes that decision, say, "Okay, fine," then he's not saying that to anybody anymore. Now, like you say, the clock is ticking. I hadn't thought of that as like the sort of watershed moment.
Because now people are saying, hold on.
Yeah. Right.
And also, it was such an outrageous thing as well. It wasn't like, was it 60 gallons or 600 gallons? It was a lot. It was like 200 pictures of this stuff. It wasn't like just like a couple of glasses.
Yeah.
And it's like, if we're going to start, this is a message, which is the message of the New Testament. It's the message of the great story. It's a message of extravagant love.
Yeah.
Like, we're going to start, we're not going to just give you a thimble full of wine.
Yeah.
Here we go.
Yeah.
And then I like Thomas going, hold on. How did he do this?
Yeah, because that's the moment you switch over to Thomas, right?
Mm.
And then Thomas is sort of blown away. But then again, it's like sort of a few chapters later, you've got Thomas being like, okay, that was pretty weird, but it's not quite enough. Like, surely I've got to see a little bit more. And then
which he does. But then at the end of his, it's not the miracle. He goes, it wasn't the miracles that changed my heart. It was his love for people, for love for us. It's like the miracles he knows. The head part says this is undeniable. I've seen the guy walk on water. I can't. But it's like it was his love that really changed me.
Well, the most famous story of Thomas in the Gospels is him sort of demanding to see the wounds of Christ. And Jesus says something really interesting to him, which is he sort of appears to him and says, "Here I am, Thomas, touch my wounds." And he says, "You believe because you've seen. Blessed are those who believe without seeing." But I don't know if you've ever noticed this, but if you look at Christian art, it's always Thomas touching the wounds of Jesus. But the gospel never actually says that Thomas touches the wounds.
Yeah.
It just says that Thomas demands to see the wounds. And when Jesus shows up and says, "Here I am," Thomas drops to his knees, and says, "My Lord and my God." And there's one reading of the story as if to say, Thomas had thought that what he wanted was like empirical evidence and to see the miracle. But when actually confronted with the person of Jesus, he realizes that that's not what it's about. I quite like that reading of John's Gospel.
Yeah. And also like, no, you're good.
Yeah. Yeah.
But also, I remember that when I first understood that, it used to challenge my faith a bit. Because I used to think, well, hold on, maybe Jesus could be a ghost. He actually didn't feel the blood and the wounds.
Yeah, right.
It's like, maybe he's a ghost. But then the next line, he sits and breaks bread and
he's
fish
like
with
eating,
them. Which kind of fun. And then I found that reassuring.
Yeah.
My life is a whole, listen, my faith stumbled. You've just seen, you basically summed up that's how my faith goes. And moments of doubt and then quite reassuring. And then back to my knees to listen to Mary to say, do whatever he says. You've just witnessed it.
Yeah. That's a great, I've not thought of the moral of the story of the wedding at Cana in that way. The sort of just do what he says.
Tell me about you. Tell me where, because you have such a brilliant understanding of all this, much greater than mine. Where does it leave? How do you feel about all of this?
Well, thank you. I'm interested in the New Testament from a sort of scholarly perspective. And
when did that begin?
A few years ago, I think I was talking about religion and theology, and I had a biblical scholar on my show. And as so often happens, I might have an expert in animal consciousness. And so I'll say, okay, this week, I've got to sit down, I've got to learn about how octopus brains works. And as happened with the octopus brains, the same thing happens here, which is actually, this is way more interesting than I thought. And I want to keep looking into this. And so for me, the thing, I talk about this and I debate this all the time, and I debate whether Jesus was God or whether he even claimed to be God and all of this kind of stuff. But for me, the undeniable thing is that there's this extraordinary historical figure who did something extraordinary. And there's something really weird that happened that caused a bunch of people to start quite early on worshipping him, which is a very strange thing to do to a human being, especially in a Jewish culture. And so, to me, getting at the Gospels from a scholarly perspective helps me to understand who this historical figure was. That's the thing I'm really interested in, almost in the way that somebody might be really interested in Julius Caesar or in whether the Iliad, whether the Trojan War really happened and whether that kind of stuff. I sort of take this approach.
That feels to me like that was your point of entry.
Yes. Yeah.
But you've had such a journey and you've met so many amazing people and you've debated so many different angles and things.
Yeah.
Where's it led you to?
It's led me to, well, I used to be quite on board with the new atheism stuff. I've spoken about this a lot on my show.
What does that mean?
You know, like the sort of Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, it was really popular, the debates that they were doing, they called it new atheism.
Yeah.
And it was this body of like atheist thought with the God delusion, this kind of stuff, which was really popular. And it had this sort of quite strident, debate me bro kind of attitude. And I was really swept up by that. I thought that was really exciting and cool. And I was beginning to sort of shake that off and grow up a bit, essentially. And then running the podcast, what I've realized is that this is far more interesting and intricate. And I would say plausible than I'd given it credit for before. So, I'm still not a Christian. Some people say to me, like,
it's a funny word though, that anyway.
Yeah.
Like I'm less and less certain about the word.
Yeah.
You know what somebody said to me the other day? You're like this. The period of greatest growth ever in the history of the church was from 33 AD to 350.
Yeah.
And during this time, there was no church buildings, no sermons, but no singing, and no Bible.
Yeah.
And like we get very tied up in all of those things and the labels and even the phrase Christian.
Yeah.
It's like I'm not sure where for me, it feels quite like man-made, these sort of words.
Yeah, and that is where I can definitely agree with, especially a Christian of your kind, which is to say someone who will say that and recognize that. Because some people place a lot of stock, particularly Catholics, they place a lot of stock in church tradition and the traditions that developed after Nicaea. And I look at that with a similar kind of man-made skepticism. And I think to myself, it also gives me license to, when I look at the New Testament and I think, some scholars think that Paul maybe didn't write that letter and that's a big problem. But for someone like me, it's like, who cares? If I decide that Paul didn't write 1 Timothy, then I'll just look at the rest of it and I'll try to work out what came between the lines. A good friend of mine said to me once, when there's all this discussion about whether we have the real words of Jesus and whether the Gospels are accurate and whether it's all apocryphal stories, he said that because these were written from early church traditions, Jesus was a real man who was doing real things. We can still know a lot about the character of Jesus. He said, imagine if, for example, have you heard of the Churchillian drift, where like quotes get attributed to Churchill, even though he never said them? Same thing happens with C.S. Lewis. Yeah. And he said, imagine if the only information you had historically about Churchill was a book of apocryphal quotes that he never actually said, but that people believed he said. You'd still get a pretty good picture of the kind of person Winston Churchill was.
That's worst case scenario. You still get a pretty good...
You're still getting an image. And so I'm really interested in the scholarly stuff and like, well, did Jesus really say that? Was this an interpolation? Blah, blah, blah. Is this a translation thing? But the thing that's most fascinating to me below all of that is like, who was this guy and what was he doing to cause all of this? Even if it's a bunch of confusion and confused timelines, and even if some stories got in there that shouldn't have got in there, the fact that this scramble to write all of this down and turn it into
even with the drift,
exactly, it's still
I think
extremely interesting.
If we could time travel, you would be one of the rough gang. So would I. I don't think you'd be. I mean, even though you kind of like the headlines have used like, professor sort of Oxford. Well, are you a professor?
I'm not a professor, no.
You're very clever. Do you know what I mean? That could potentially like put you into the Pharisee type thing. Right. But you are the opposite. You are what you would have been running wild with Jesus, I think.
Yeah, I like that.
And also, I sort of always got the feel with Jesus. He loved the challenge. He loved the riposte. He loved the mental, verbal, like theological challenges.
There's a lot of jousting, a lot
of jousting and brilliant sort of responses that have never been better. You know, whether it's in like, should we pay our taxes to Caesar or not? You know, the Pharisees are trying to trip him up.
Mm-hmm.
And yet sort of that response of just like, well, whose head is on the coin? You know, pay to him and pay to God what is God. It's sort of brilliant.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a brilliant
And I would think that I see a beautiful alignment, actually. I think if we would go back in time travel, you'd be running wild with him.
Well, if the science ever gets there and we manage to go back in time, when people say, you know, where would you go?
Yeah, where would you go? Come on, what would you do?
Of course you'd go to meet Jesus.
I love it. What point? Where would you go? Would you go after the resurrection, or would you want to be there at the beginning? What about in the 17 years?
That's interesting. You know, I think that the moment that you'd want to witness, if you could only have 5 minutes, would be the moment of the crucifixion. And the reason is that you would see that this was a man, the crucifixion happened, you would see whether the curtain tore, whether the sky opened, all of that kind of stuff. And it would give you all of that. I mean,
But they keep finding evidence for like the, I think in the sort of, you know, the stars stuff and they said there was
like the solar eclipse.
The solar eclipse. I've actually done it. It's the exact kind of like
That's really interesting.
It's really interesting. And also that moment is kind of also to see the first ever Roman Christian. Well,
yes, yeah.
The centurion
truly
son of God.
Yeah.
This man is the son of God.
But then part of me
that's interesting. You go to that moment. That's kind of cool.
But part of me would say, although, you want to see the resurrection, you want to see part of me wants to say I would just like to meet him walking along during his ministry and just say, listen, man, I've got 5 minutes.
Yes.
Who are you? Like,
are you the real deal?
Messiah, are you God? Are you claiming to be God? Like, that's what I'd want to do. I'd want to ask that question. And I mean, where would you go in Jesus' life?
So
5 minutes.
So it's so interesting, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah. I don't know. Yeah. I think, so, I mean, if you think of the biblical, so there are a lot of people that did get that chance and did it come exactly for that purpose.
Mm-hmm.
You know, say, I mean, one bit you might not have noticed that I really like is John the Baptist's relationship with Jesus. We kind of touched on it, but there's a really nice moment where if you think if anyone in the Jesus orbit is going to believe in him, it's John the Baptist.
Mm-hmm.
Known him from birth, kicking inside my mother's stomach whenever Jesus walked in the room. Like, I know this guy is a real deal. I'm baptizing the River Jordan, saying there was one is coming after me is like, you know, I know.
Mm-hmm.
And yet when he was in Herod's prison and he gets a chance to get a message to his disciples, the one thing he says is go back to Yeshua and just ask him, you really are who you say you are.
Is it you?
And I love that because like, if even John the Baptist had doubts, because of he's like being tortured and in a brutal prison and like we're human, you know, then I can have doubts. And it's like, he's been a real hero of mine, actually, John the Baptist.
Me too. I think he's my favorite person.
Well, it's interesting you say that.
So
I'd be interested what I like about him is that everyone always, Jesus says there's no one being greater.
Yes.
He is the number one in the prophets, number one. And I always think like, we think to be number one in life, you've got to be like a leader. You got to be like, I would think Moses or one of these people, like on top of the mountain, the big beard, the loud voice, the authority. It's how we're brought up to think these are our people in our lives who are the leaders.
Mm-hmm.
And yet it was the rough one who lived off the land and was wild and just loved this Yeshua character. You know?
Yeah.
And he said, no one better. Why do you like him?
I think he's fascinating because he seems to be this sort of precursor to Jesus in a weird way. He's the introduction to Jesus. There's a bit of mystery as to who he was and why he was baptizing and why he found his way into the wilderness and what it means to preach a baptism for the repentance of sins and why Jesus would need to undergo that. All of these questions are so interesting. There are also communities of people who particularly revere John the Baptist. There's a group called the Mandaeans who are like this Gnostic sect who think that John the Baptist is the most important prophet. Now they see Jesus as a false prophet. Actually, there's this whole historical like fascination with John the Baptist because and it's also the insistence early on that he is not the Messiah. You do it in
keep
the
saying
book as well.
I'm not the guy,
which implies to me that at the time there were lots of people who thought he was the Messiah. And
because that's what happens. People want to think somebody's great, and then the power goes to your head.
And when Herod Antipas first hears about Jesus, he goes, this guy is John the Baptist reborn in the Gospels. And so what was John the Baptist doing if when he hears this Jesus guy, it reminds him of John? So it seems like John the Baptist had this incredible ministry, and he must have been doing all kinds of interesting things, and there were all kinds of people who thought he was the Messiah. And so, and we only get clues to that in the Gospels. And so I'd be fascinated. Do you know what? Maybe I'd go to the baptism, because I'd love to meet John the Baptist.
With the sky open.
Yeah, that would be pretty cool to see too, you know?
Because if you see that, then you know. Because you can't fake that, you know. So in a way, that's as convincing as a resurrection. Because if you're there and you literally see this guy up in the voice of God going, this is my son.
And the dove, you kind of get a proof of the Trinity.
Well, it's like...
You get to meet John, and you get to see Jesus. It's all there. I think
you know what?
that
they
might
all
be the
saw
moment.
all these things. And yet still the next day,
yeah.
they would go, well,
not so sure.
The clouds could have... And was it thunder that sounded? And that dove, you know, there had been a few doves around that day.
Never enough. What I do know, though, is that... I speak to a lot of interesting people. I speak to some scientists. If I ever meet one who tells me that they're onto something with time travel, I'll know who to call to go back and meet John the Baptist.
I love it.
Bear Grylls. Thank you for your time.
Well, you know what? You're such a great guy, and really, I really mean it. You're doing such a beautiful job. Keep seeking, like all of us. And we're told when we seek, we find.
We'll see how it goes. Thanks again.
You're a great man.
Awesome. You made a video a few years ago now asking whether Jesus was a magician. An interesting title, because it sort of conjures up images, if you will, of Jesus walking around with a sort of wizard hat on, acting like David Blaine, doing a bit of sleight of hand kind of magic. But I don't think that's the kind of magic that scholars have in mind when they're talking about the ancient world. What is the kind of magic that we're talking about in that time period?
I mean, it's a great question, because when we think of magic in English, it conjures, to use that term again, the folklore pop culture idea of a magician. So the Harry Potters, the Gandalfs. It also brings up ideas of stage performance, like David Blaine, but also there's we use it as a term to describe a category of ritual performance. And there's, contemporary Wiccans today, contemporary pagans and witches that practice what we would call magic. And when we use terms like that, we think of these smaller scale rituals that might include various potions or ritual paraphernalia like magic wands. So we kind of have these three valences of magic: the folklore, the stage performance, and then a category of ritual. And when I was asking that question, and was Jesus a magician, we kind of have to grapple with all three of those ideas. And this came up controversially in the late 70s with the ancient historian Morton Smith, who basically published a book called Jesus the Magician, and he argues exactly that. Like, Jesus, for all intents and purposes, was a magician. The problem with the book is he doesn't quite grapple with what he means by magician, but what I really appreciate what Morton Smith did back in the late 70s was he challenged our categories of miracle versus magic. Because when we think of miracle, we kind of have a sense of what that means. Doing these wondrous feats of supernatural power, raising the dead, walking on water, turning water into wine. But also magic are wondrous feats that are supernatural and unexplainable. And when I talk about magic in the ancient world, people try to trot out definitions like, oh, miracles are this, and they provide a definition, and magic is this, and they provide a definition. But I can always find examples in ancient literature that kind of explodes both of those categories. Things that we would call, miracles look kind of magical, and things that are magical look miraculous. And the example that comes up in the Gospels are what I call the spit miracles, or the saliva miracles. There are two miracles in the Gospels where Jesus uses spit to effectuate the miracle. There's one in the Gospel of John where he puts saliva onto a blind man's eyes to make him see, and then also in the Gospel of Mark, he puts, I think it's mixing mud and spit, and puts it on the guy's eyes, and it half heals him. And he's like, oh, I see a little bit, but people are walking around and they look kind of like trees. And then Jesus does it again, and he's completely healed. And the interesting thing is that Jesus is using a substance to work the miracle. Usually he doesn't use substances. He says a powerful phrase like "peace be still," or he heals by touching. So this is an example of some sort of substance being used. And that's usually the first definition that people try to bring out when they're trying to define magic. Like, oh, well, magic requires materiality, like potions or what have you. And I'm like, well, Jesus has at least one example where he does use this, so can we call him a magician?
Now, the term magician is interesting, right? Because, of course, whenever we're dealing with ancient literature and ancient ideas, they're not used like speaking and writing in modern English, right? And so when we hear words like magic or magician or indeed sorcerer or anything like that, what kind of words do we tend to be talking about in like the New Testament and Greek and maybe some other sources too?
Yeah. And this is a really good question, because when we say magic in English, it is derived directly from the Greek, but when we go back to the Greek source of the term, it doesn't have that exact equivalence to our modern day word magic. So magic is derived from the Greek word magia or mageia, which itself comes from the Persian, and it refers to the practices of the magi, the magoi, the arts and practices of the magi. And this refers to priestly religious functionaries in ancient Persia, and it made its way into Greek, referring to all sorts of things. So some early Greek authors like Herodotus did try to use the word magoi kind of anthropologically or ethnographically. They're like, oh, this is a term used for Persian priests, and they do priestly things like divine the will of the gods. They perform sacrifices. Sometimes they do more uncanny things like dream divination, but nothing that would be like outside the realm of like the usual functions of a priest in antiquity. But around the exact same time that Herodotus was writing these things, other Greek writers were starting to use the word magoi or magus in kind of a pejorative sense of spooky, illegitimate wonder workers. I think Heraclitus, for example, uses the term in reference to like the Bacchic mysteries or the mysteries of Dionysus, where they're kind of frenzied or enthused, mantic kind of people who are called magoi. And in that sense, it's kind of used as a term of, othering. These people do weird stuff over there. I don't do weird stuff here. So this term magia pretty quickly has connotations of spooky otherness, illegitimate ritual, ambiguous ritual that we don't really know how to define, or we don't like outright. And so that's how it gets received into the Roman period. So by the time Jesus is walking around, nobody's calling themselves a magus in a sense of I'm proud to be a magus. When you think of the job title of Harry Potter or Gandalf, they're called wizards, and it's not a bad thing. It's their job title, their in-universe job title, as it were. But nobody's going to call themselves. Simon Magus is called Simon the Magus. He's this figure in the book of Acts, and he's not a good figure. He tries to buy his way into supernatural power to give the Holy Spirit to people by laying on hands. But he's not called Simon the Magus because he wants to be a magus. It's because people on the outside are like, oh, he's doing bad stuff, we're going to call him Simon Magus. So this is where I take it up with Morton Smith, where he was using this term magician. He's eliding our English sense of the term and with the ancient sense of the term. Even though the ancient term was a term of accusation, you call someone you don't like a magus because they're doing spooky things called magia, which is illegitimate ritual that we don't like. So in that sense, I would say Jesus was not a magus, but what he was doing is ambiguously is ambiguous. He's doing these powerful feats that we're not sure how he's doing it, or there's instances in the Gospels where people are actually afraid of what he's doing. Like he exorcises the legion of demons in Mark chapter 5, and the audience is kind of scared, like, oh man. So like the audience could read the same text and see him doing these feats of supernatural power and interpret them either morally, like, oh, these are miracles, or immorally, oh, this stuff is the work of demons. I'm going to call this magia. And this is where I make the argument that miracle and magic as categories of ritual are subjective. They are in the eyes of the beholder. If you like what the guy's doing, and if you think he's getting the power through God or angels or something good, oh, we're going to call it miracles. But if he's doing the power through the power of demons, oh, we're going to call it magic. And we see hints of this with the so-called Beelzebul accusation, where in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus, exorcises demons, and then his opponents are like, "Oh, well, you're exorcising by the power of Beelzebul, who's this demonic figure." So even his own critics were like, "Oh, even an exorcism, which we might think of as a good thing, getting demons out of somebody, you could be doing it through illegitimate means." And New Testament scholars like Giovanni Bazzana at Harvard Divinity School have made arguments that this might be one of the kernels of the Gospels that we're pretty confident are historical, that Jesus might have been positioning himself as an exorcist because this story would be both his opponents and his proponents viewed him as an exorcist, but his opponents called him, infused with the power of Beelzebul, and that because this is an accusation being hurled at him, this accusation might actually date back to his lifetime as the historical Jesus being accused of being a demon worker. So this is what I mean by a category of ambiguous or illegitimate ritual, because you can look at the exact same ritual, an exorcism, and put it into two moral buckets: miracle or magic. And I would say there's no anthropological sense where we can define miracle vis-a-vis magic. They're both in this broad anthropological category of thaumaturgy or thaumaturgical performance, which is the technical term of wonder working. And sometimes that wonder working could be clocked as evil, and sometimes it can be clocked as good. But as the anthropologist, as the archaeologist, as the historian, we can't look at that and be like, "Oh, this is magic, this is miracle." It's all thaumaturgical performance, and the opponents of Jesus would move it into the illegitimate bucket, thereby calling it magia.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot to unpack there. One important thing to point out is that, of course, when we ask sort of, was Jesus a miracle, a magician, you and I aren't looking at this and thinking like, we have to believe that Jesus actually performed these miraculous feats, and how do we interpret, was he acting by demons or was he not? When we say magician, I mean, I don't think that Jesus was really performing miracles as he was walking around, but the thing we're interested in is not literally was he performing magic or was he performing miracles, but rather the stuff that he was accused of doing and said to have done, these miraculous workings and healings and things. How were they interpreted, not only by his contemporaries, but also by sort of early writers who were reacting to what Jesus had to say? And so, we're kind of looking at how Jesus was received. Of course, a Christian is going to look back and say, this is ridiculous. He wasn't a magician, he was a miracle worker. But as you said, it's not so much that there's a dispute about what Jesus was doing, but rather by what powers he was doing them. And I think the best example to draw this out is our earliest Christian critic, Celsus, and his sort of, battle across the decades with Origen. So maybe you could tell us who Celsus was, who Origen was, and what that can tell us about not disagreeing about what's happening, but just disagreeing about how it's being done.
Yeah. Yeah, and just to back up, you're right. Like we as historians, as scholars of the New Testament, we're not making judgments on whether Jesus was actually performing miracles. That's not a question for a critical scholar of religion to be trying to tackle. We're reading these texts that are not uncomplicated eyewitnesses of the life of Jesus. They are biographies of the life of Jesus that have a particular rhetorical goal in mind. But I would say that it's very plausible that Jesus would have positioned himself as some sort of faith healer, because you see faith healers or exorcists today. You can go onto YouTube right now and see Pentecostal ministers performing faith healings in front of their audience. So that is well within the realm of an ancient social role, where they position themselves as a ritual specialist casting out demons. And we, as the critical anthropologist who is not saying demons exist or not, we're saying, oh, this person at least is participating in this discourse of demonological power, where they're like, oh, I know how to control demons, let me show you. And I would put that in the realm of ritual studies, where they're doing a ritual that we would call exorcism. And you're right, there is this Greek philosopher named Celsus, who was writing in the late 100s, who apparently was really miffed by Christianity. He was scandalized by it, thought it was stupid or silly, and he wrote a giant rebuttal against Christianity. And we don't have that text. It doesn't survive in its whole, but it does survive in quotations from the early church theologian Origen, who's an Alexandrian Christian philosopher and theologian, who wrote this text against Celsus, which was basically a line-by-line rebuttal of Celsus. So we have huge quotations from Celsus because Origen quotes them. And it seems that Celsus hurled the accusation of magia against Jesus. He straight up says Jesus went to Egypt and learned from the Egyptians. It's kind of this exoticizing argument from the Greek mindset. Oh, if you want to learn anything spooky and sorcery type, like go to Egypt. So in Jesus's flight to Egypt, according to the Gospel of Matthew, he must have learned the ways of the Egyptian magoi and learned how to do supernatural powers. But he doesn't dispute that the powers were real. Celsus seems to take that for granted, that Jesus must have been doing some sort of powers, but he attributes it to demons. He attributes it to exotic training in Egypt, and he also makes arguments of like fraudulence and charlatanism. So he does leave room for both it being fake, but also through the power of demons. And Origen is like, well, no, he's helping people. He's getting this power through God. But I think the against Celsus argument, where Origen and Celsus are going back and forth in this text, is case in point, where we have both Celsus and Origen are reading the same text. They're reading the same thaumaturgical performances in the Gospels, and Celsus clocks it as demonic and magia, and Origen clocks it as miraculous and through the gifts of God and the Holy Spirit. So they're moving they're looking at the same text, looking at the same performances, and they're moving it into two different moral buckets: magia or miracle. And we see that today as well when people say, "Oh, Jesus is a magician," they're trying to move it into like the spooky realm. Oh, they must be doing something illegitimate, or he must have been doing something illegitimate or different. And then the apologist saying, "Oh no, he was doing good miraculous powers that were not relying on those things that we think are magical, that require potions and stuff." So it is kind of a battle over these subjective categories, even though I would say the thaumaturgical performances are in the eye of the beholder. And I would say let's not side with Origen or with Celsus. They're both trying to fight a different value-laden battle. We can approach this topic more anthropologically. Was Jesus positioning himself as a ritual specialist of some sort?
One interesting thing before we spoke, you recommended this huge text, the Guide to the Study of Ancient Magic, I think edited by David Frankfurter. And there's a chapter in there on early Christianity by, what's his name? Joseph
Sanzo.
Sanzo, that's right. And one thing he pointed out in this essay or this chapter that I found interesting was that in the birth narratives, you get this, at least in Matthew's, you get this mention of these magi, right? People think of them as the wise men or the magi from the east. And it's this word, right, magi, which, as you say, comes to be a pejorative term. If you call someone magi, it's kind of an insult or a mark of suspicion. But in Matthew's birth narrative, the Magi are the protagonists of the story. They correctly identify the position of Jesus. It seems like, they're good people in the eyes of God. He sort of leads them there. He also shows up in a dream and warns them. And so he points out that at least at the time of the writing of that gospel, or at least of the birth narrative part of the gospel, that term didn't necessarily have that same pejorative connotation, right? Like as if it used to be something that just wasn't that bad.
Yeah. And that would be an example of the term still being attempted to use in a more anthropological, ethnographic sense. So in the Gospel of Matthew says the Magoi from the East came and were able to find Jesus, I don't think there's any hint of the spooky, illegitimate. There's exoticizing there. I think Matthew is positioning these figures as purveyors of exotic knowledge who were able to see the truth despite not being from Judea. But we don't see any hint of Magoi as purveyors of illegitimate ritual. So this does, we do see this around the 1st century BCE, the 1st century CE. Philo of Alexandria also talks about the Magoi as priestly philosophers who know that they can talk about the divine. So it's not like 100% everybody was like, oh, if I hear Magoi, I'm thinking illegitimate sorcerer. But Simon Magus appears in the book of Acts, and these Magoi appear in the Gospel of Matthew, and both of these texts were written within a half century of each other at least, if not closer. but writers of both these texts can use that term either as a pejorative term, Simon the Magus, that bad guy doing bad stuff, and the Magoi in the birth narrative of the Gospel of Matthew, those purveyors of exotic wisdom. So even into the Roman period, we do see a range of semantic meaning for this term. It's, I would say, pretty overwhelmingly a pejorative term. I think even because the term magia shows up in the book of Acts as well, and it's referring to illegitimate ritual. But again, I think people at that time still would have thought of it, oh yeah, that's referring to Persian priests as well. So it has a range of semantic meanings. Some writers would try to use it more anthropologically, and some would use it as a term of accusation.
I'm really interested in some of these sort of ancient indications that people were interpreting Jesus as a magician. Of course, Orthodox Christianity, as we know it, would reject that label, but of course, they agree that he was performing these miracles. One of the most interesting cases of this that I learnt about from your materials, yours and Esoterica, Justin Sledge as well, who's you sort of collaborated with on this kind of topic, is there's this image from the catacomb of Giordani underneath Rome. And I'll have my wonderful editor put it on the screen. Sorry for the extra work there, Alex. It's this image from, it's like some kind of wall painting or something, really. It's quite simplistic. And it depicts Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, which is a very sort of common scene to depict in Christian art. But he's holding this stick. He's like pointing this stick at Lazarus and using that to raise him from the dead. And it kind of looks like this wand-like instrument, which there's no mention of in the Gospel of John. And yet somebody has decided to give him this stick in art. And what might this tell us?
Yeah, that's a good question. This motif shows up a lot in early Christian art, not just in catacomb frescoes. So in a lot of catacomb frescoes, Jesus is holding some sort of thin, a wand-like stick pointing toward Lazarus, oftentimes Lazarus, but sometimes like multiplying the loaves and fish. It shows up in sarcophagi carvings, Jesus holding a staff, like a short rod of some sort. So this is sometimes trotted out as, oh, look at this. This is examples of even people back then thought of Jesus as a magician. The real question, though, is this how magicians would have been portrayed in ancient art? These are devotional images of Jesus in the Christian catacomb, on a Christian sarcophagus. So that alone should tell you they were not thinking of him as a magus, because of that, or a goes, which is another term for a sorcerer. So they're obviously not thinking of him like that, because that's for Celsus to say. He's the opponent to Jesus. These are devotional images. So the short answer is a magic wand is part of the toolkit of a wizard in our modern understanding, our pop culture understanding of a magician. And that seems to derive from European folklore, maybe Northern Europe, possibly even Norse folklore, but it doesn't seem to have been part of the toolkit of a magic worker in Greco-Roman mythology. We do have one very notable example in the Odyssey, where Circe is this sorceress figure who does have a rod. It uses the term rhabdos, which means just stick or rod. And when she turns Odysseus's men into pigs, she uses potions. It uses some sort of derivative of the word pharmakia, where we get the word pharmacy. And then also she has a rhabdos. The argument would be she's using the potions to turn them into pigs, not the wand itself. I think that's a little bit parsing maybe too much. It's part of her toolkit, but it's not something that shows up again and again as a trope. Medea is another famous sorcerer in Greek mythology. She doesn't have a wand. Stick-like ritual implements show up all the time in Greek and Roman ritual contexts. Roman augurs had the litus, which was kind of a curved stick that was more of a symbol of power, like a scepter. Hermes had the caduceus, which was, the entwined snakes around a rod, but he doesn't seem to use it magically. So the short answer is I think an ancient audience would have walked up and seen that catacomb fresco. Their mind wouldn't have immediately went like, sorcery, like Circe. The argument put forth by the scholar Lee Jefferson is that it's actually a reference to Moses's staff. So the staff of Moses, where he strikes the rock with a staff. There's actually a fresco, a catacomb fresco, where Jesus is on one side with a staff pointing toward Lazarus's tomb, and then on the other side is Moses striking the rock. So there's like parallelism in the actual catacomb painting, where they're positioning Jesus as the new Moses, or standing in this lineage with Moses. So then you can make the argument, well, is Moses being positioned as a magician? Moses actually does show up in like Greek magical papyri as some standing in some lineage of thaumaturgical power. The short answer is wands were not part of the toolkit of a magic worker in antiquity. The long answer is these images are ambiguous, and I think even if Celsus looked at that fresco, he would be like, "Aha! Look at that! It's just like Moses, who's in that magic book over there." So it would have been moving Jesus into one of those moral buckets again, though the artist who painted that catacomb fresco was not thinking magia when they painted that. They might have been thinking, "Oh, Moses, the staff of Moses held by Jesus now."
Interesting. I see. Okay. And so if that's not what people would be looking for to identify a magician, a sorcerer, like what would they be looking for? I mean, today we would imagine, if we're not talking about, pop magic, because today there are still magicians. There are people who practice magical practices with their sort of grimoires and their books full of spells, and you've got like Wicca, pagan types people. I don't really understand a lot about the way that they function, but it's got a lot to do with magic, and presumably that's not quite the same as it was in the ancient world. Maybe it was, but if we're not looking for a stick and a wand and whatnot, like what would identify a magician in the ancient world outside of the odd sort of spit miracle?
So the short answer is magician was not a job title in antiquity. Magician was magus. Magus was a term of accusation. Nobody called themselves that. But when we look at rituals that we would call magical, like amulets or curse tablets, so in the Roman world, in the Greek world as well, if you wanted to curse someone, you would write a curse onto a piece of lead, and you would roll up that piece of lead and pierce it with a nail, and you would deposit it in a grave or throw it into a bonfire or bury it under an altar in a temple. If you were trying to curse a chariot team, you really don't want the green team to win. You would curse the chariot team, then bury it under the starting gate of the hippodrome.
Wow.
We would call that cursing. We would call it an amulet protection. We might lump it all into this category of magic. But what is the job title of someone who makes an amulet or a curse tablet or a magic gem? It's not magician, it's a scribe, it's a metal worker, it's a gem artisan. And their toolkit doesn't include a magic wand, it's a chisel and trying to make their little magic gem. So my whole job as a historian of ancient magic is to try to demythologize it. It's actually quite mundane. If you really wanted the green team to lose, you would go to the local lead guy, buy some lead from him, and then maybe take it to the local scribe and say, "Hey, what do you got for anti-chariot curses?" And then he would write it down on the curse tablet for you, because you're probably illiterate or semi-literate, and then you would bring it to where you want to bring it. You would bring it to a hippodrome, but a lot of the curse tablets we find are found in temples. There's a temple to Demeter and Persephone on the slopes of Acrocorinth, which is this big mountainous rocky outcropping jutting up out of the ancient city of Corinth. And archaeologists found a bunch of curse tablets buried around an altar, a series of altars in this temple precinct. And you would be like, oh, well, that was like sneaking into the temple and burying it. But how would you possibly do that? What's more likely is it was part of the normal functioning of that temple, where the priestesses of Demeter were like, hey, let me help you with that. I'll show you where you should put your curse tablet. We see this. There's a double temple to Isis and Mater Magna, the great mother goddess, in what's modern day Mainz, Germany. It's a double temple. You have one temple to Isis, one temple to Magna Mater, and archaeologists found a bunch of curse tablets half melted in like a burn pit behind the temple. And a lot of these curse tablets draw attention to the fire, like just like how this curse tablet melts, may my target Alex melt. And they would roll it up and then throw it into the burn pit. Some of them apparently did not melt, and for archaeologists to find many years later. It was probably part of the normal functioning of that temple. Bring your curse tablet to the temple of Isis and Magna Mater, and deposit it into the burn pit. And yet another example was found in England at Bath, the city of Bath, which was an ancient town to the goddess Sulis Minerva, who is the syncretized goddess between Sulis, who was like a Celtic goddess, and Minerva, obviously a Greco-Roman goddess. And again, in the temple precinct, you had the temple, and outside the temple, you had the altar, and right off to the side of the altar was a spring. And we found a bunch of curse tablets. I say we, a bunch of archaeologists found a bunch of curse tablets deposited in the spring. And they were for really mundane stuff, like so-and-so stole my hooded cloak. May justice be brought down upon his head. A lot of them were for like petty crime. And so I think of that little spring in that temple precinct as kind of the lost and found of the town. Like, did you lose your hoodie? Did you lose your money?
This jumped out at me because I recently I went to an event where I had to wear like white tie, like tuxedo with tails and everything. And I got this top hat and it went missing, and I'm pretty sure someone stole it. And when I saw in your video that the quote from that curse on that sort of ancient tablet reads, "I curse him who has stolen my hooded cloak, that the goddess Sulis inflict death upon and not allow him sleep or children now and in the future until he has brought my hooded cloak to the temple of her divinity." And I instantly thought of my top hat, and I thought, gosh, if I could get someone to write out on an amulet a curse like that, then I would probably do it. It's really interesting to see. But one thing that you also pointed out, actually, I think you pointed this out in your video on grimoires, is that we're not just dealing with, like, when you think of ancient people sort of cursing each other, you might be thinking of, your sort of disgruntled farmer or whatever, but these are physical materials, written materials in the ancient world. We kind of forget today, like, how difficult it is to produce written materials in the ancient world, right? Not just because of the physical labor involved in bringing them out, but also because hardly anyone was literate. And so given that these curses and things and these spells and these books of spells that begin to develop throughout history, you might think of them as sort of some wackos out in a cave somewhere writing stuff down, but you have to be pretty educated, right, to even be able to write this stuff. So what does that tell us about the kind of people who are engaging with this?
Yeah. Well, let's use the curse tablets, from Bath, England, as an example. We've found probably 160 of them there, maybe 180, so dozens and dozens of these curse tablets with varying ranges of skill when it comes to the handwriting. Some seem to be cursive Latin that's very difficult to read. Some of it seems to be a more bookish, professional hand. So there must have been some sort of a range of literate skills coming to the table here. But the ones that are very professional probably were made by professionals. A professional scribe whose whole job was, let me help you write your get my hoodie back curse that you can then bring probably with the help of a priest of Sulis to deposit it into this pool. So at least for the textual magic, anything written on a piece of papyrus or an amulet was probably created, I say probably, almost certainly created by some sort of literate specialist. And who were the literate specialists in, say, late Roman Egypt? It was monks and bishops, Christian ecclesiastical functionaries. So much of the ancient so-called magical formulas from late antique Egypt show evidence of somebody with knowledge of Christian liturgy. So a phrase like "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty," the so-called trisagion that appears in both Jewish and Christian liturgies, very prominently in Christian liturgies, shows up all the time as kind of a protective incantation that shows up on amulets that people would roll up and put on a necklace or put it in their pocket. Psalm 91 is another common protective phrase, which says, like, God is my refuge and my fortress. He protects me from the snare of the hunter. So it's a very protective formula. This appears inscribed on, like, the edges of, like, these circular medallions that people would wear, with a picture of, like, Solomon spearing a demon. Again, with the Hagios, 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 holy, holy, holy phrase. So the vast majority of at least late Roman magical formulas that show some sort of Christian influence were probably made by the literate specialists of that era, which were monks, priests, and bishops. And when we look further east into Mesopotamia, we find a whole corpus of incantation bowls, little clay bowls, something that you'd eat your ancient porridge out of. And in these bowls are inscribed these spiral incantations, usually against demons, sometimes specifically against a demon like Lilith. They're found buried upside down in the house, maybe as like an ancient roach motel where you're trying to capture the demon and neutralize it. And a lot of these show they're written in Jewish Aramaic. They show evidence of rabbinic literature. So who was the ritual specialist in a Jewish community in 6th century Mesopotamia? Rabbis. So you initially asked me, like, what does a magician look like in antiquity? I'm like, that's not a job title. The person who was making an amulet or an incantation bowl, they were monks, they were rabbis, they were metal workers, they were gem workers. So much of this was coming out of workshops. It was just part and parcel of a marketplace of ritual power in the Roman Empire, and nothing about it would from the material evidence indicates it was secret or occult or evil. We'll sometimes see Roman law codes complaining about magic, particularly curse tablets or anything that you could view as poison, trying to poison someone with potions. So anything that's kind of aggressive or harmful, we'll sometimes see law codes against that. But of course, how could you possibly enforce that in the Roman Empire? Like it's not like it was you had like one Roman jurist per 100,000 people. It's not like these laws could have been easily enforced. Instead, you had temples like the Temple of Sulis in England or the Temple of Isis and Magna Mater in Germany offering it as part of their regular services. So I dispute the question. There weren't magicians in antiquity. There were magicians, magoi, in folklore and mythology, and then there were people who offered ritual specialties to clientele that we might call an amulet worker, or a rabbi who on the side made incantation bowls, or a monk where somebody in the hinterlands of late Roman Egypt came up and said, "Hey, my baby has typhus. What can you do for me?" "Well, let me write you an archangel amulet to put on the baby's forehead. That's going to help." It was part and parcel of daily life in antiquity.
And this kind of practice shows up across religious traditions. I mean,
yeah,
I've heard you talk, again, when you're talking about grimoires, about people who would, aren't there Islamic communities that will take the words of the Quran, sort of write them onto, some kind of material, and then wash the words off into a bowl of water, and then drink the water, and somehow that's part of their, like, ritualistic practice. This kind of stuff crops up all over the place, and I guess it's not so much about. There's another point raised in the reading that you sent over, is that, like, there's sort of two questions. There's what was magic in the ancient world and who called each other magicians, but also what would a modern scholar look at and say, this is what today we might call magical practice, even though they didn't call it that then. And I guess we're sort of more doing the latter, looking back at just sort of practices that people engaged in, and today saying that's what we might now sort of broadly put into the magical category.
Well, so I go out of my way to avoid the term magic, at least in my own work, because I don't find the term useful to describe a category of ritual. I would try to be a little more precise and say we have cursing rituals, we have protection rituals, we have healing rituals, we have exorcism rituals. Some of them use paraphernalia like potions or mud or spit, and some of them just use the spoken word, but they all fall under these categories of healing, protecting, exercising. And it's kind of, again, because the term magic is subjective and up to the audience, the eye of the beholder. I'll sometimes call a behavior, a ritual, magical, and that might offend somebody. I'm like, well, like, I'm purposely doing that to try to show you that there's really not a huge distinction. So an example would be John Chrysostom. He was the bishop of Antioch and later the bishop of Constantinople. This was in the 300s and early 400s. He complains constantly about people in his audience, his congregation, using amulets. And in some of his homilies, he's like, "Oh, some of you are using coins of Alexander the Great as an amulet. Like, why would you possibly rely on the king of this Greek king when you could rely on the King of Kings, Jesus Christ, to protect you?" And then in other homilies, he, like, explicitly says, "Hey, you want to keep demons away from you? Do the sign of the cross. The sign of the cross is a great way to keep demons away from you." And I'm like, what makes that gesture legitimate and another gesture to keep demons away from you magical? This is a gesture versus an object, but we could probably think of some sort of gesture that would be clocked as magical, even though it's just a gesture to keep you to protect you from supernatural harm. And the answer is, well, John Chrysostom is playing a value and judgment game where he's like, this is a legitimate ritual and this is an illegitimate ritual, even though from the outside both an amulet and crossing yourself to keep demons away from you both fall under this category of protective ritual. And there's another example. There's the Acts of Peter and Paul is an apocryphal text from the 400s. I think it's 5th century CE. That is it's almost reads like a comic book. The Apostle Peter and the Apostle Paul are facing off against Simon Magus, that spooky bad guy from the Book of Acts, and they have an audience in front of Nero, the Roman emperor, and they're kind of doing a thaumaturgy battle where Peter does a work of power and then Simon does a work of power, and it culminates with Simon building a wooden tower, and then he climbs to the top of the tower and he starts flying, and Nero's like, well, all right, Simon won, look at, he's flying, that's like the ultimate power. And then Peter says, well, watch this, and Peter then says, oh, angels of Satan that are carrying Simon into the air, stop. And they drop him and Simon falls to his death. But Simon doesn't use a magic wand, he's not using potions, he's not using amulets or any materiality. He's speaking just like Jesus would in like the Gospels. He says, dogs come forth, and like these supernatural dogs appear and leap at Peter, and then Peter says, gone, and then the dogs disappear. And then Simon doesn't really say anything. He just starts flying, and presumably these demons or angels are carrying him through the air. So this is why I'm like, from the outside, if we try to describe what Simon is doing from a completely neutral anthropological perspective, it's just miraculous powers. But the author of the Acts of Peter and Paul, it is unambiguously saying what he is doing is magia, and what Peter is doing is miracles. Like, one is from Jesus and God, and one is from demons, even though they're really just doing the same thing, which is speaking power into, doing power through ritual performance.
So does that mean then that, circling back to the question we started with and the question that you title a video about, was Jesus a magician, is the point that this is like a meaningless question? I mean, it seems to you like that's a difficult category to sort of even discuss. But I mean, I know that's your view, but presumably there are scholars out there who think it's a perfectly serviceable category and will discuss whether Jesus fit into it. And so, if I were to ask you that question, is that how you'd answer? And how do other scholars tend to interpret that question?
Yeah. So I would say Celsus thought he was a magus. I would say he was not a magician in the sense of the folkloric sense of a magus. Like the gospel writers position him as a wonder worker. Was he a ritual specialist? We can at least say it's plausible. He wasn't, as far as we know, he wasn't a gem worker or an amulet maker or an incantation bowl maker. Like those are job titles that we can identify as a social role in society. Someone who makes an amulet, someone who makes a curse tablet. I think it might be plausible that he was positioned himself as like a stage exorcist, faith healer, like, hey, let me show you that I have power over demons. Because we see that in roughly contemporaneous materials as a social role that did exist in first century Judea. So Josephus, for example, talks about a exorcist named Eleazar who exorcises a demon, I think in the audience of Vespasian, the Roman emperor. Eleazar uses a ring of Solomon and some sort of incantation, so he's using some sort of ritual paraphernalia. The Dead Sea Scrolls, there are a few examples of exorcistic formulas. So exorcisms were being performed in first century Judea and the Galilee. And it's hard to parse what parts of the Gospels are historical and what are not, but it is at least within the realm of plausibility that Jesus would have positioned himself as a ritual specialist. But I wouldn't call that a magician, because I do find the term hopelessly fraught. And the scholars that do work on this material, I think would agree with me that they are very careful to parse between the mythological or the fantasy or the pop culture caricature of the sorcerer or the magician versus the historical social role of a ritual specialist. And that looks a lot more mundane. Somebody in their workshop making an amulet, then a priestess of Demeter taking that curse tablet and burying it in a room in the temple precinct. Like, it's just a lot more mundane than like Harry Potter shooting light out of a magic wand. So we had to parse the caricature versus the social role. And Jesus was certainly a caricature was made of him by Celsus. So there was at least something about the Gospels that made Celsus think, oh, this guy is in the same realm of Medea or Circe. But then from the anthropological point of view, that was not someone walking around calling themselves a magus.
You said ritual specialist a few times. I remember in your video you talked about this concept of a freelance ritual expert, which Heidi Wendt, I think, has written about. Are they the same thing? And if not, what is a freelance ritual expert?
Yeah. So ritual expert is just like in some sense, a hopelessly broad term, just someone who specializes in a particular type of ritual. You could say a priest is a ritual expert who knows how to lead the liturgy and knows how to lead the Eucharist. Some of those religious functionaries went on to use their liturgical skills to make amulets for your sick baby. So Heidi Wendt wrote this very excellent book talking about ritual experts that are not tied to institutional, like a church or a monastery or a temple precinct. So someone that might, through just their own charisma or skill, have a following, and that following might be mercantile or economic in the sense of like selling their skills. So
hence
Celsus actually, hence freelance
ritual expert.
Yeah, and the freelance also implies the non-institutional aspect of it. I mean, some of these holy men in the late Roman Empire were not tied to a particular monastery or church as well. You could have a guy off in the desert, like St. Anthony.
I think of John the Baptist when you mention this,
Yeah.
as a sort of disconnected from institutional authority, some kind of expert ritualist that people are going to, seeming to be working of his own accord, performing a kind of ritual which, absent the tradition of baptism, if we'd never heard of baptism and we discovered this ancient ritual where human beings were submerged in water and came back up as a different kind of, it would have this sort of spooky cauldron-esque feeling to it, I think. And so there's a world in which that could easily have been seen as some kind of magical practice, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think John the Baptist is a great example of a freelance ritual expert. Like, he possibly through his own creativity reworked this ritual, this water ritual. Water rituals were a known thing within Judaism at the time, and he had his unique spin on it. The sectarians living at Qumran, where we get the Dead Sea Scrolls, also had their own unique spin on water rituals within the worldview of Judaism. And John the Baptist, apparently not connected to any sort of institution, wandering through the desert, having a following based on his own charisma. I think he would fall well within that idea of a freelance ritual expert. Whether he was selling his skills or not, we don't know. We have no reason to believe that, but he was a freelancer in the sense of he was not tied to a particular institution. So freelance ritual experts, they're relying on their own charisma. They're relying on their own ability to convince people of their skill. And I would say Jesus as an exorcist or Paul as a preacher, they would fall under this. There's arguments to be made that Christianity grew so successfully because of holy men like this who were able to convince people, hey, I have control over demonic forces. So many of these holy men, I was about to mention St. Anthony, who's one of the Desert Fathers. A biography or a hagiography was written of him by Athanasius, the Bishop of Alexandria. And St. Anthony, like the whole biography is just him like conquering demons left and right. And I think the historian Ramsay MacMullen makes this argument that Christians, more so than other religious institutions and religions of the time, position themselves as having power over evil spirits. And it was through that ritual performance they were able to get so many followers. People weren't necessarily convinced by the hopeful message of the gospel. They were like, oh, that holy man, that St. Anthony, that guy out in the desert, I hear he can get rid of the evil demons that are plaguing, my kid or haunting that cave over there. So we should listen to this guy. He seems to have that power. And it's kind of the holy man's role in the late Roman Empire to parse and identify demonic powers in the landscape and then ritually exorcise them, whether from a person or from a building. And again, to go back to John Chrysostom, he basically does that as well, teaching his audience, hey, do the sign of the cross. This is how you get rid of demons, how to keep them away from you. So much of early Christianity was about demonological control.
Isn't there an interesting, there is an interesting moment in Acts chapter 19 where we hear about these 7 sons of Sceva, who are these Jews who are going around driving out evil spirits and trying to invoke the name of Jesus, sort of finding possessed people and commanding spirits to come out of them in the name of Jesus, who Paul preaches about. And it seems like it's kind of like not working, because one day the evil spirits say back to one of these sons, I know Jesus and I know Paul, but who are you?
Yeah.
And then the man who has the evil spirit, the possessed man, like jumps on this guy and starts like attacking him and sort of beats him mercilessly, such that he gave them such a beating that they ran out of the house naked and bleeding. And so there's this idea that there really is something special about like Paul, which we already knew.
Mhm.
Paul's a special guy, but there's kind of this feeling that like it's Jesus who does the demonic exorcism, but this idea of there needing to be ritualistic experts, and exorcism is a kind of ritual. There's a hint here as well that even if you are somebody who's going around, performing exorcisms in Jesus' name, you kind of have to be a particular kind of person invested with a particular kind of power. And I don't know, if I saw that and I saw two people doing the same thing and then the sort of demons listened to one of them, I'd be quite inclined to think that there's something special about that Paul guy. He's got some kind of particular magical power that the others don't. And you're saying it's potentially part of the explanation as to why Christianity could grow, because Paul kept doing that kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, so there's this towering figure in sociology named Max Weber who developed this idea of charisma. So when we think of charisma today, we think of those, self-help YouTube channels about how to be a charismatic person. But originally in the religious studies sociological sense, it's about someone with like almost otherworldly abilities and power. So when we say like Jesus was a charismatic figure or John the Baptist was charismatic, it was because they were viewed as, imbued with miraculous power and standing and touched by God. And so much of the freelance ritual expert, I think, hinges on that charisma, your ability to convince people, hey, I can control these demons. And so we see a lack of charisma with the sons of Sceva. What's interesting, so the word exorcism, it derives from the Greek exorkizo, which is actually a legal term. Exorkizo. It means, it's related to the Greek word meaning oath, horkos, and it's used in a legal sense of putting someone, commanding someone as if under an oath. We actually see the exact same verb in Matthew 26 at the trial of Jesus, where the high priest says, I exorkizo you, I put you under oath, are you the Messiah? It's the exact same
Really?
verb. And he's not saying I exorcise you as a demon. He's saying I'm commanding you under oath. And we sometimes translate this with the unusual English verb adjure. I adjure you, which just means I command as if under oath. Are you the Messiah? And so when Jesus is saying I exorkizo you, talking to a demon, it's like I am putting you under an oath. I'm putting you under a legal obligation, like get out of that person.
Wow.
So this again points to how so much of what we would call magic or thaumaturgical performance is the purview of literate specialists, where they would use legal terms like that. It also tells us something about ancient people viewing law as having power. I mean, we see that here in the 21st century. Like if you're sued or you're like said to go to jail, you're compelled to do something. So even in antiquity, like legal language has power. And it's so much of it is the exorcistic formulas are pretty formulaic, as in I adjure you, I exorkids you, I put you under an oath by some power. Usually then you list some sort of power, by the power of God, by the power of Sulis Minerva, and then some sort of threat of some sort. So there's these formulas, but all in this kind of legalese sense.
Can I ask you, you've mentioned a few times about sort of amulets and writing, and we've talked about books, and I mentioned this word grimoire earlier. Could you just tell us what a grimoire is and its relation to magic? And particularly, I'm interested in the usage of like the Bible by some Christians and sometimes as a kind of grimoire of a kind.
Yeah. So when we say grimoire, in a technical sense, it usually refers to some sort of magical handbook. You can maybe even use the word a textbook. So a book that's a collection of formulas, a collection of instructions on how to make amulets. And it's used like that in the modern sense. So you might have a contemporary Wiccan or a contemporary witch who would keep their own book of shadows, which is a grimoire in a sense of like a collection of incantations or rituals. And in the context of antiquity, we see compendia of formulas usually surviving in Egypt. So there's this big collection of texts called the Greek magical papyri, which is a modern category where scholars brought all these texts from ancient Egypt, from the Ptolemaic period up through the late Roman period, and kind of published them in these books that we call the Greek magical papyri. But there are all these different disparate scraps of papyri that are brought together into this kind of artificial category. Really what these were texts created by Hellenized Egyptian priests operating in the Roman Empire. And it was part of their job to collect, as literate specialists, collect these rituals and put them into compendia that we might call a grimoire. Like here's a scroll with a bunch of instructions. Like here's how to fix a migraine headache. Here's how to fix a sick stomach. Like your stomach feels bad. Some of these texts are very short. Like write this. So do you have a scorpion sting? All right, write this formula onto a piece of papyrus. Put the piece of papyrus on your scorpion sting. You'll be okay. Some of these texts are long, almost beautiful poems. There's one called the Mithras Liturgy, how you kind of go through this multi-stage formula to interact with Helios himself, the sun god. So grimoires, are the purview of literate specialists. There's arguments over whether people were actually doing these rituals. Was that priest then going out and helping someone? Hey, do you have a scorpion sting? I have just the thing for you. Or was it just part of like the bookish mindset of like the encyclopedic mind of trying to collect all these texts into a text that you would then pass on to the next your apprentice? But the idea of the grimoire as a book of magic, this continues through many centuries of occult knowledge, where the grimoire is how ancient specialists regulated knowledge, passed on knowledge to the next generation. But to the semi-literate population who doesn't really know how to read, the written word itself is viewed as efficacious. So if you were living in late Roman Egypt and you barely know how to read, when you pick up a book or a scroll or look at some sort of piece of writing, your first thought is not necessarily, oh, these are words conveying meaning. You're encountering them as graphic symbols, symbols on a page. So there's theorists in the religious studies would talk about the magic of the written word, where humans through most of history, since most humans throughout history were not literate, would have viewed the written word as inherently powerful because of this. And a great example of this, at least in the Christian tradition, is the so-called story of King Abgar, where King Abgar of Edessa, which is a city in southeastern Turkey, so modern-day Şanlıurfa, King Abgar gets sick, so he writes a letter to Jesus and says, hey, can you come to Edessa? I'm sick. I need you to come heal me. Jesus writes back and says, hey, I'm really busy. I can't make it, but I'll send one of my disciples to heal you. Which is an interesting story. It's not historical. It's an apocryphal story. But what's interesting is that this is one of the few examples of Jesus writing something. So this letter of Jesus to Abgar goes down in Christian history as a magical object. We have amulets from ancient Egypt, preserved in the sands of Egypt, that Christians apparently wrote the letter of Jesus to Abgar as an amulet. We have stories from historians like Procopius who mention cities writing the letter of Abgar Jesus on the city gates to protect from invasion. The city of Philippi, which is famously from the city of where Paul writes the letter of the Philippians, there's an inscription found that used to be on the city gates of Philippi that was the letter of Jesus and Abgar to protect the city gates. And the argument is like, well, these words have inherent power. Like ritual power is infused into these letters because the hand of Jesus touched this pen, which then touched this letter, pen to paper, and the graphic symbols themselves that we call words. Who cares that it's a kind of boring, banal letter? Hey, I'm busy. I'll send my disciple later. It doesn't say anything like protect this city from invasion. It's actually a pretty simple letter. But the fact that the words themselves were written by Jesus or believed to be is what matters. What makes them magical.
Well, there is
So to
something
go,
there's something really magical about sort of language, the written language that we've kind of
Mhm.
forgotten about, in that you can imagine not being literate. It's a bit like, I saw someone the other day sort of typing in a sort of non-Latin script. So if you imagine
Mhm.
like, someone who's Chinese or Japanese or something, like writing something out on a computer. And I saw someone doing this the other day, and I was just sort of mystified about like
Mm.
how these symbols translate into words. Hieroglyphics are the same. The way that we look at those, with like, yeah, we understand that it's a language, but it's so fascinating. There's something almost like eerie about the way that these images sort of contain communication.
Mhm.
It's just, like harder to notice that we're doing the same thing with our language, of course. But if you couldn't read the English language and you saw these scribblings on a page and someone took a glance at it and, now they just know something new, it would seem, for want of a better word, a bit magical, a bit sort of spooky,
Yeah.
and so,
And then
especially given that
think
it's a
about the
physical
ritual
object.
and then think about the person who wrote it. Like, oh, that person
Yeah.
also must have special power because that guy, that scribe, knows how to write this. So
They're conjuring it up.
they're conjuring it up. So you can see how the literate specialist might be viewed as a purveyor of thaumaturgical performance because they're able to write, which 5% of the population might have been able to. No, it's a really smart observation, and we see that play out in what we could call pseudo writing in ancient magical practice, where these fake letters that mean nothing pop up all the time in amulets and curse tablets. They're sometimes called characteres, or the word character, where they look like letters, but they don't really mean anything. Some of them look like ring signs, where you'll have like an X, but with like little rings at the end of each spine of the letter. Some people attempt to draw what they think looks like Hebrew or Egyptian. That I mentioned, that bronze amulet that has Psalm 91 around the edge. God protect me from the snare of the hunter. And then there's a picture of Solomon spearing a demon, and then squeezed in between some of the figures or what appear to be the tetragrammaton, YHWH, written, but not in Hebrew. It's like someone who obviously doesn't know Hebrew, but is like trying to draw Hebrew letters because they like, oh, this is the mystery language, the tetragrammaton. I'm going to put this on my anti-demon amulet. And we see this in the Greco-Egyptian magical papyri, where depending on your language, your native language, if you're a Greek speaker, you want to have Coptic as, Coptic, the final stage of the Egyptian language, as your magical language. Or if you're a Coptic speaker, you either want hieratic or some earlier form of Egyptian writing or language as your language of magic, or maybe Greek. So you kind of see this the exoticizing power of different languages, whether it's a pseudo-script or like a symbol that means nothing, or your attempt at drawing Hebrew or hieroglyphs or demotic or something like that.
You know what it makes me think of? You know about cargo cults? You've probably heard of these, but these...
Yeah, vaguely,
sort of interesting groups of people who tend to live on sort of isolated, like islands, tribes of people who live on these islands. And during like the colonial period or during like the World Wars or something, Europeans would come and visit these islands, and they would bring cargo. They'd have all of these sort of wonderful things with them. They'd have food, they'd have weapons, they'd have all sorts. And then they sort of, went away, and these tribes are sort of left to try and understand what's just happened. And there have developed these religious movements around this cargo. And so the John Frum cargo cult went viral not long ago because they sing together. And it's quite a sort of eerie but beautiful kind of singing. And it went viral on social media, this clip of them all singing. And they're singing about the return of John Frum with his cargo. And one really interesting thing that I can't remember who it is that did this, but once upon a time, a landing strip for an airport was built, in the middle of the forest or whatever, and an aeroplane came down and dropped off all of this cargo, and then they all sort of went away. And so in the hopes that the cargo will come back, some tribe somewhere had built an airport out of like sticks, out of wood. They'd sort of built like a control tower and a runway and stuff, sort of thinking that this might somehow incant this plane to come back, as if the airport being built was what made the plane come. And it seems like a similar confusion's going on there with like, well, if we just sort of write these scribbles on a page that look a bit like this, it somehow sort of does something a bit religious and a little bit magical. It just kind of made me think of that people are sort of misfiring about what's going on. But it's easy to see why, if you didn't know what an aeroplane was or an airport was, it's easy to see why you might think that this runway with its flashing lights and stuff would cause this magical aircraft to come. In the same way, if you couldn't understand the written word, you might be mistaken into thinking that there's something about these mystical scribblings that literally brought about the sort of magical powers or religious significance.
Yeah. I mean, we've been talking so much about writing, but we can also think about materiality, like the object of lead.
Yeah.
Why lead for curse tablets? Not all curse tablets were written on lead. Some were papyrus. A few were like crystal, like gypsum or something or like quartz. But lead, it was easy to find. It was easy to work with. I've tried writing on lead before. It's actually quite easy because it's such a soft metal. But it's also cold and dark and heavy. And a lot of these curse tablets draw attention to that fact. Like, just as this lead is cold and heavy, make so and so cold and heavy. So the materiality matters. This comes up in so-called magical gems as well. So you can think of like a signet ring where you have like your let's say your signature on a ring, and you stamp a piece of clay, like I'm authorizing this letter with my signet ring. These sorts of gems also show up in magical practice in the Roman Empire, and the gem type would sometimes correspond with certain powers or certain abilities. So hematite, which is like this iron oxide semi-precious stone, was thought to have some sort of healing ability, sometimes for blood bleeding, to anticoagulant almost. So we have evidence that they would actually grind up hematite and ingest it to try to heal you. There's also a few examples from the Greek magical papyri that mention grinding up a magnet and ingesting it, which is just kind of inherently interesting. So the materiality matters. It's not just the writing; it's what you're writing on. And sometimes it's kind of mundane, like to take a piece of laurel or to take a particular leaf, and then sometimes it's kind of purposefully odd or different. So in the magical papyri, it always mentions like animal parts, like take a recently drowned cat and then use the cat for some sort of formula. I think there's an invisibility spell that's like take the dung of a dung beetle and spread it on you, and it will make you invisible. And this
Maybe that
this
will
is
make
why
it might have that seem like it has that effect, because suddenly people don't want to go near you or seem to sort of pretend like you're not there. I can certainly imagine.
This is why I sometimes wonder were these Egyptian priests really trying these out, or were they just collecting them in kind of an encyclopedic sense? Because I don't know if somebody attempted the dung beetle invisibility spell and like, it's just not working. But
yeah, or maybe they were just playing a prank on someone they didn't like. Maybe they just didn't like someone and said, "Oh yeah, I think I heard that this is probably what you need to do. Just rub dung all over yourself and see how that works out." Although I've never tried it. Who knows? Maybe it works.
I mean, I talk about it in one of my videos, but I've yet to try that particular spell. It has not been put to a double-blind study, to my knowledge. My hunch is it probably won't work.
It would make for a very good YouTube video. I know that much. Maybe the next time we meet, we can put it to the test. We'll flip a coin to see who's the observer and who's the participant. I don't know, but it's a far cry away from the materials that we create, which literally seem not even to have a substance that they're written on. I mean, we're sort of talking through electromagnetic waves in the air or whatever. It's interesting to think how things have developed, and I think the most important thing is recognizing that the kinds of spells and books and texts of this period are not like a PDF that you'd read online. I mean, they are in the sense that it's the same material, but there's this sort of sacrosanctity to physical objects. It's not just the information, but it's the fact that you've got a physical object with etchings in them that somehow contain information. It's much more, seems much more magical than, a PDF on a screen, I guess.
Yeah, I do wonder. I mean, this is well outside my subfield, but contemporary witches who do keep their own Book of Shadows, like, can a Book of Shadows be a PDF file, or does that just remove the so-called magic of writing that we were talking about? You remove the materiality and you remove the magic, remove kind of the etching on the object. Digital witchcraft in the 21st century. Somebody needs to study that.
You end your book on grimoires, your video on grimoires, talking about whether these books can count if they're like on a PDF, because the physicality is so important. I'd be interested if there are any sort of witches out there who think that it does count as a grimoire to have a PDF. What happens when I turn off the computer and the grimoire is still like stored in the hard drive with like a bunch of zeros and ones, but it's not actually currently on my screen? Does that count as a grimoire? There's so many questions, and maybe I should have a witch on the show to discuss them. But at least as far as magic and Jesus goes, We've covered some good ground. You do more on your own channel. People probably already know it. It's in the description. It's Religion for Breakfast. Congratulations on 1 million subscribers, by the way. I know that didn't happen super duper recently, but it's really, really cool to see. You've also just started a really interesting project called the Religion Department, right? Can you tell us about that?
Sure. I mean, I've been doing YouTube videos for well over a decade now, and there's only so much information you can convey in a YouTube video. And I try my best to show you the scholars that I'm citing in my videos. I'll have their picture pop up and say, Dr. So-and-so studies this, and this is what they argued. And, through making Religion for Breakfast, I have all these connections in the academic study of religion, and I'm trying to bring those scholars to you with the Religion Department, which is a learning platform with religious studies scholars teaching guest lectures, multi-week seminars on everything. We have language classes like Coptic, which is the final phase of the ancient Egyptian language. So we have a Coptic class coming up this semester. We have a scholar of contemporary witchcraft teaching a class on paranormal beliefs in the United States. So you can join as a member of the Religion Department and take classes with these professors and kind of learn. I always view myself as just a translator of scholarship. So much of Religion for Breakfast is not like my own ideas. It's me taking complicated ideas from other anthropologists and historians and sociologists and then presenting it as a YouTube video. And here it's like bringing the academy to you. And it's
a cool project. I'll link that down in the description down below as well. It's like, I guess, if you want to do like an academic study of religion, but academic study, it costs a lot of money, it takes a lot of time, you've got to show up to class and whatnot. I mean, I guess there are remote things and whatnot, but like for much, much cheaper and much, much more convenience, you choose the classes that are interesting to you. It seems like
or
a
something
cool
you
way
might not have access to. I mean, I went to Coptic is not a language that's offered in very many universities.
Right.
Probably just a small sliver of universities in the world offer ancient Coptic. But we had dozens and dozens of people show up for our summer Coptic class and are now reading the Gospel of Thomas in Coptic. Like, that's just so cool. It's awesome, like if you're like a super nerd of religious studies as I am, and so many people in the Religion for Breakfast audience are, and your audience for that matter, like if you want to, in a very affordable way, learn ancient Coptic or the sociological study of American paranormal beliefs, like this is a place to do it.
Yeah, YouTube videos can only go so far. So if you want to go deeper, the links are in the description. But YouTube videos are worth it too. And I hope that this podcast proves it. Andrew Mark Henry, thank you so much for your time. It's been great to talk to you again.
Thanks for having me.